The morning of April 28, 1943, Hill, 609. Tunisia. Staff Sergeant William Peterson crouches behind a limestone outcropping, his M1 Garand pressed against his shoulder, the walnut stock warm against his cheek in the North African sun. 150 meters downslope, 5 German soldiers advance in a skirmish line through the scrub brush, their Kar98ks rifles held at port arms, bayonets gleaming. They move with the confidence of men who have fought across 2 continents, who have learned that warfare follows predictable rhythms. Fire. Work the bolt. Chamber the next round. Fire again. The mathematics of combat calculated by the timing between shots. The pause that every rifleman needs. The vulnerable moment when a soldier lifts his bolt handle and becomes momentarily defenseless. But Peterson carries a rifle that eliminates that pause completely. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The 5 Germans have trained for years with their weapons. They understand bolt-action warfare. They have calculated engagement distances based on the assumption that American soldiers carry rifles like theirs, that any firefight will follow familiar patterns, that the man behind cover will need to work his bolt between shots, creating windows of opportunity where a trained infantryman can advance or return fire. But the intelligence reports filtering back from the Pacific Theater have been troubling. American Marines on Guadalcanal describe rifles that fire continuously. Japanese commanders reporting impossible volumes of fire from positions that should have been overwhelmed. Something has changed in the arithmetic of infantry combat, and the German soldiers advancing up Hill 609 are about to learn what that change means. Peterson's section, 8 men from the 34th Infantry Division, has spent 4 days fighting for this worthless piece of North African rock. They have climbed through terrain that should have been impossible, under fire from positions that should have been impregnable, armed with a rifle that military historians will later recognize as the first true revolution in infantry firepower since the invention of the repeating rifle itself. The M1 Garand weighs 9.5 pounds loaded, carries 8 rounds of 30-06 Springfield ammunition in an en-bloc clip fed through the top of the receiver, and functions with a gas-operated semi-automatic action that cycles automatically with each trigger pull. Rate of fire in the hands of a trained soldier, 40 to 50 aimed shots per minute. The Kar98ks, carried by the approaching Germans, weighs 8.6 pounds, holds 5 rounds in an internal magazine, loaded by stripper clips, and requires manual bolt operation between each shot. Rate of fire for an experienced marksman, 15 rounds per minute. If he's fast, 20. If he's exceptionally skilled and doesn't care much about accuracy, 1 American rifleman can deliver more rounds downrange per minute than 3 German soldiers combined. This is not a small advantage. This is a fundamental shift in what one man can accomplish on a battlefield. Peterson watches the Germans through his rifle sights, the aperture rear sight aligned perfectly with the front post, his breathing steady as he tracks the lead figure, 140 meters now, still advancing, still confident, still unaware that they are walking into mathematics that will destroy them. The 34th Infantry Division earned this position through blood. The battle for Hill 609 began on April 27th when Major General Charles Ryder received orders from I-2 Corps Commander Omar Bradley to take the strategic high ground that German forces under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim were using to observe and direct artillery fire across the entire sector. The hill rises 600 meters above the surrounding terrain, its limestone slopes providing natural defensive positions that the Germans had fortified with machine gun nests and mortar positions, creating interlocking fields of fire that made any approach suicidal. American casualties during the first day's assault had been devastating. The 133rd Infantry Regiment lost 40% of its strength climbing slopes where German riflemen could engage at leisure, where every meter of advance came at the cost of men who died trying to close with an enemy firing from prepared positions. But the 34th Division had learned something important during those first terrible hours. They had learned that their M1 rifles could deliver suppressive fire that German bolt-action weapons could not match, that an American squad could generate the volume of fire that kept enemy soldiers pinned down while other units maneuvered. Peterson had watched this realization spread through his company like wildfire, watched sergeants who had trained with bolt-action Springfields suddenly understand what they could accomplish with 8 rounds that fired as fast as they could pull the trigger, watched squad tactics evolve in real time as men figured out that you didn't need to pause between shots, didn't need to duck behind cover to work a bolt, could maintain continuous aimed fire while moving or while holding a position. The Germans hadn't adapted yet. Their doctrine still assumed that American infantry carried bolt-action rifles, that any firefight would follow predictable patterns where both sides needed to work their actions between shots. The intelligence summaries from Tunisia made this clear. German after-action reports describing American firepower in terms that suggested confusion, reports that estimated higher numbers of automatic weapons than the Americans actually possessed, assumptions that attributed the volume of fire to machine guns rather than to rifles. But Peterson knows differently. He knows exactly what his rifle can do because he has been doing it for 4 days straight, firing, reloading, firing again without ever losing his sight picture, without ever giving the enemy the pause they need to return effective fire. 120 meters. The Germans are still advancing. Peterson can see their faces now, can see the way they scan the hillside looking for targets, can see the way they move in practiced formation with proper intervals that make sense when both sides are armed with bolt-action rifles. But those intervals assume that the defender will need time to work his bolt between shots. They assume windows of vulnerability that do not exist when the defender carries a Garand. Peterson glances left and right, confirms that his 7 Marines are in position, confirms that every rifle is loaded and ready. 8 M1 Garands, 64 rounds of 30, .6, ready to fire, without a single bolt needing to be worked, without a single pause in the volume of fire that is about to destroy the German skirmish line completely. 100 meters. Peterson can hear the Germans now, can hear equipment rattling, can hear the soft crunch of boots on rocky ground. The enemy soldiers are moving carefully, professionally, using the terrain for cover, advancing in rushes that would be effective against bolt-action rifles that needed time to cycle between shots. Peterson settles his breathing, lets his finger take up the slack in the trigger, tracks the lead German through his sights. The Garand's trigger breaks clean at 4.5 pounds. Single stage. No creep. Just steady pressure until the sear releases and the firing pin strikes the primer. The rifle bucks moderately against his shoulder, the recoil manageable, the gas system cycling the action automatically while Peterson maintains his sight picture and tracks to the next target. The other 7 Garands open up in sequence, each rifleman firing at his own pace, each shot aimed and deliberate. The semi-automatic action that John Garand spent 16 years perfecting functions exactly as designed, extracting spent casings and chambering fresh rounds faster than any bolt-action mechanism ever built, faster than the Germans expected, faster than their doctrine prepared them for. The lead German stumbles, falls. The second tries to go prone but takes a round before he can complete the movement. The third manages to bring his Kar98ks up to firing position, manages to chamber a round, manages to take aim, but Peterson's second shot reaches him before he can fire. 18 seconds from the first shot, 8 M1 Garands have delivered 48 rounds of aimed fire, while the 2 surviving Germans are still trying to work their bolts for a second shot. The tactical advantage isn't subtle. It's overwhelming. The survivors break and run, scrambling back down the slope, while Peterson's section continues firing. The Germans leave 3 Kar98ks, 98Ks scattered in the brush, bolt-action rifles that worked perfectly, that never malfunctioned, that were accurate and well-made and completely outclassed by the American semi-automatic weapons that had just demonstrated the future of infantry combat. Peterson reloads, the empty en-bloc clip ejecting automatically with the distinctive metallic ping that will become one of the most recognizable sounds of the Second World War. He slides a fresh clip into the magazine. The bolt rides forward to chamber the first round, and he's ready to fire again in under 3 seconds. A German soldier with a Kar98k would need at least 5 seconds to reload 5 rounds using a stripper clip, assuming he wasn't under fire, assuming he had time to carefully guide each round into the magazine. Staff Sergeant Miller crawls over from his position 10 meters to Peterson's right, his own Garand still pointed downslope. "They didn't know," he says quietly. "They thought we had bolt actions like them." Peterson nods, checks his ammunition. 32 rounds expended, 24 clips remaining. They know now. But the Germans don't just know now. They've been learning for 2 years, ever since the first M1 Garands started appearing in American infantry units in the Pacific, started changing the mathematics of combat in ways that German military planners hadn't anticipated and couldn't easily counter. The story of that learning process, the story of how the German Wehrmacht discovered that they were fighting with rifles designed for a previous generation of warfare, begins not on Hill 609 in Tunisia, but in the factories and design bureaus of 2 nations that approached the problem of infantry firepower from fundamentally different directions. Springfield Armory in Massachusetts began work on a semi-automatic rifle to replace the bolt-action M1903 Springfield in 1920, when the U.S. Army concluded that existing technology could finally produce a self-loading rifle reliable enough for military service. John Cantius Garand, a Canadian-born engineer who had joined Springfield Armory in 1919, spent the next 16 years developing what would become the M1. Originally designed for a .276 caliber cartridge, the rifle was rechambered for 30-aught 6 Springfield when Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur decided that enormous stocks of existing ammunition and the need for commonality with machine guns made changing calibers impractical. The Army officially adopted the M1 in 1936, making the United States the first nation to field a semi-automatic rifle as its standard infantry weapon. Production began slowly, with Springfield Armory producing the first rifles while designers refined the gas system and resolved early reliability issues. By 1941, Winchester Repeating Arms had joined production, and American factories were turning out thousands of rifles per week. The German experience followed a completely different trajectory. The Kar98k, adopted in June 1935, represented the final evolution of the Mauser 98 system that Paul Mauser had designed in 1898. It was shorter than the full-length Gewehr 98, more maneuverable, optimized for modern infantry tactics that emphasized mobility over the massed rifle fire of the Great War. The Kar98k was an excellent rifle. Accurate, reliable, simple to manufacture, easy to maintain. Its controlled feed bolt action represented decades of refinement. Its 2-lug bolt locking system was as strong and dependable as any mechanism ever designed for a military rifle. But it was still a bolt-action rifle, and bolt-action rifles required manual cycling between shots. This meant that no matter how well-trained the German soldier, no matter how quickly he could work his bolt, he could never match the rate of fire that a semi-automatic weapon provided. The best German rifleman with a Kar98k could deliver perhaps 20 aimed shots per minute. An average American soldier with an M1 Garand could deliver 40. The German military understood the theoretical advantages of semi-automatic rifles. They had tested various designs throughout the 1930s, including the Gewehr 41 series and later the Gewehr 43, but these weapons never achieved the reliability or production numbers necessary to become standard infantry issue. By 1944, when the war in Europe had already been raging for 5 years, fewer than 500,000 G43s had been produced, compared to over 4 million M1 Garands that American factories had built by that same date. This production disparity reflected a fundamental difference in industrial philosophy. The United States had designed the M1 Garand for mass production from the beginning, with generous tolerances that allowed faster machining while maintaining reliability, with standardized parts that ensured rifles from different factories and different production runs would use interchangeable components. German rifles, even late-war Kriegsmodell simplified versions, required more skilled labor and tighter tolerances that slowed production and made it impossible to match American output. By the time American forces landed in North Africa in November 1942, as part of Operation Torch, Most U.S. infantry units had transitioned completely to the M1 Garand. The rifle had proven itself reliable in training, had demonstrated accuracy that exceeded original specifications, and had begun to establish a reputation among American soldiers as a weapon they could trust. But the North African campaign would be the first major test against German forces, the first time American riflemen armed with Garands would face Wehrmacht soldiers armed with Kar98ks in sustained combat. The results surprised German commanders who had studied American doctrine but hadn't fully understood what the semi-automatic advantage meant in practical terms. Lieutenant Werner Schmidt of the 334th Infantry Division kept a detailed diary during the Tunisia campaign that was captured after his unit surrendered in May 1943. His entries from late April provide a German perspective on the firepower disparity that American soldiers like Peterson were exploiting on Hill 609. Schmidt wrote on April 26th, "The Americans attack with fewer men than our doctrine suggests should be necessary for the ground they take. Their rifle fire is continuous, overwhelming, like facing machine guns from every position. Our men work their bolts as fast as they can. But the Americans never pause. They fire and fire and fire. We cannot match this volume." Schmidt's observation captured the tactical reality that was becoming clear across the Tunisian front. American squads could generate suppressive fire that kept German infantry pinned down while other elements maneuvered, could maintain pressure that prevented German forces from executing the fire and movement tactics that had proven so effective against British and French forces earlier in the war. The German army had built its infantry doctrine around the MG-34 and later the MG-42 machine guns, positioning these weapons as the primary source of squad firepower, while riflemen armed with Kar98ks provided supporting fire and protected the machine gun. This doctrine worked effectively when facing opponents who were similarly armed with bolt-action rifles, where the machine gun provided the overwhelming firepower advantage that decided firefights. But against American infantry, where every rifleman carried a semi-automatic weapon, the doctrine began to break down. An American rifle squad in 1943 consisted of 12 men, a squad leader, a Browning automatic rifle gunner and assistant, and 9 riflemen armed with M1 Garands. This squad could deliver approximately 360 to 450 aimed shots per minute, more if the situation allowed rapid fire at shorter ranges. A German rifle squad of 9 men equipped with Kar98ks and an MG-42 could theoretically deliver more fire through the machine gun alone, but the machine gun was a crew-served weapon that required setup time, that attracted immediate attention from American fire that couldn't be everywhere at once. The American advantage lay in distributed firepower. Every rifleman could suppress enemy positions, every soldier could maintain continuous fire, every position could deliver rates of fire that previously required automatic weapons. This meant that American infantry could operate more flexibly, could spread across wider frontages, could maintain offensive pressure in situations where bolt-action armed infantry would have needed to pause and reorganize. Peterson witnessed this advantage firsthand during the final assault on Hill 609. His company attacked along a 1,200-meter front with squads spread across terrain the German doctrine suggested should have required twice as many men to secure. But every American squad could generate the suppressive fire necessary to keep German defenders pinned while adjacent units advanced, could maintain pressure across multiple positions simultaneously, could exploit gaps faster than German forces could react. The hill fell on May 1st, 1943. After 5 days of brutal fighting that cost the 34th Infantry Division heavily, but demonstrated conclusively that American infantry armed with M1 Garands could defeat well-trained German forces in prepared defensive positions. General Omar Bradley later wrote that Hill 609 represented the American Army's coming of age, the first clear-cut victory that proved American soldiers and American equipment could match the Wehrmacht in direct combat. But Hill 609 was just the beginning. The lessons learned in Tunisia would be refined and expanded as American forces fought through Sicily, Italy, and eventually France. Each campaign demonstrated the same fundamental advantage. One man with an M1 Garand could deliver more firepower than three men with bolt-action rifles, and no amount of training or tactical sophistication could overcome that mathematical disparity. By June 6, 1944, when American forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, the M1 Garand had become the defining weapon of U.S. infantry combat power. More than 4 million had been produced by Springfield Armory and Winchester, enough to equip every frontline infantry soldier in the European theater and most soldiers in the Pacific. The rifle had proven itself in every climate and every combat condition, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Italy, and now it would face its greatest test against German forces defending Fortress Europe. The German army waiting in Normandy had 3 years of combat experience against the M1 Garand. They had studied American tactics, had developed countermeasures, had issued instructions to their troops about how to fight against opponents with superior rates of fire. German tactical manuals from 1944 emphasized using terrain to negate American firepower advantages, using automatic weapons to suppress American positions before they could establish fire superiority, attacking at night when the M1's rate of fire advantage mattered less in close-quarters fighting. But tactical adjustments could only do so much when the fundamental disparity remained. A German infantry regiment in Normandy fielded approximately 3,000 riflemen armed with Kar98ks, who could collectively deliver about 45,000 aimed shots per minute under ideal conditions. An American infantry regiment with similar numbers fielded approximately 3,000 riflemen armed with M1 Garands, who could collectively deliver 120,000 to 150,000 aimed shots per minute. The 3-to-1 advantage at the individual level scaled directly to the regimental level, creating a firepower differential that German commanders could not overcome through tactics alone. Private Hans Becker of the 352nd Infantry Division defended a sector near Omaha Beach on D-Day. His account, recorded by American interrogators after his capture 3 weeks later, described the moment when American forces broke through the seawall and began advancing inland. We fired at them from our positions in the hedgerows. We worked our bolts as fast as we could. But the Americans, they never stopped shooting. Every man had a rifle that fired continuously. We would shoot, work the bolt, shoot again, and in that time each American had fired 4, 5, 6 times. Our machine guns kept firing. But the Americans shot our gunners. They shot anyone who exposed himself. The rifle fire was like nothing we had trained for. It was endless. Becker's experience repeated itself across thousands of small engagements throughout the Normandy campaign. German defenders who held strong positions, who understood the terrain, who fought with courage and skill, found themselves systematically overwhelmed by American infantry, who could deliver firepower that no bolt-action force could match. The hedgerow fighting in Normandy illustrated this advantage particularly clearly. The bocage country, with its ancient stone walls and thick vegetation, created countless small battlefields where company-sized or smaller units fought isolated actions, decided by small arms fire at close range. In this terrain, the German MG-42 advantage diminished because the fields of fire were restricted and machine guns could be flanked and suppressed. But the M1 Garand advantage remained constant because every American rifleman could maintain continuous fire regardless of position. Sergeant Robert Miller, fighting with the 29th Infantry Division near Saint-Lô in July 1944, described a typical hedgerow engagement. We were taking fire from a German position behind the next hedgerow, maybe 60 meters away. My squad, 8 Garands plus a BAR, put so much fire on that position that the Germans couldn't return effective fire. We weren't trying to kill them necessarily, just keeping their heads down while 2nd Squad moved up the flank. With bolt actions, we couldn't have maintained that volume of fire. With Garands, we just kept shooting. The Germans would pop up, fire once, duck back down to work their bolts, and we'd have 8 more rounds downrange before they could shoot again. This tactical pattern, American fire superiority enabling maneuver, became standard throughout the European campaign. American commanders learned to use their rifle platoons as sources of continuous suppressive fire that freed other elements to advance, learned to exploit the psychological impact of overwhelming fire on enemy soldiers who couldn't respond effectively learned to trust that 8 riflemen with Garands could accomplish tasks that previously required entire squads with automatic weapons support. The German response evolved throughout 1944. The Wehrmacht increased production of MP-40 submachine guns and accelerated development of the STG-44 assault rifle, both attempts to provide German infantry with automatic weapons that could match American firepower. But production constraints meant these weapons remained relatively scarce. By the end of 1944, American factories had produced over 5 million M1 Garands. German factories had produced approximately 1.1 million MP-40s and fewer than 500,000 SG-44s. The vast majority of German infantry still carried Kar-98K bolt-action rifles into combat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, would become the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by American forces in World War II. More than 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, struck through the heavily forested Ardennes region, targeting American positions held by units that had been sent to this quiet sector to rest and refit after heavy fighting elsewhere. The German plan called for rapid mechanized advance that would exploit American numerical weakness and winter weather that grounded Allied air power. But the plan assumed that German forces could achieve breakthrough before American infantry could establish defensive positions, assumed that superior German tactics and operational planning could overcome American material advantages. The assumption proved fatally flawed, and the M1 Garand played a significant role in why. Private Harold Shifty Powers of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, found himself defending Bastogne with a unit that was under strength, undersupplied, and surrounded by German forces. His M1 Garand became his primary means of survival during weeks of combat in sub-zero temperatures, where frostbite and hypothermia killed as many men as enemy fire. Powers later recalled, "The most amazing thing about that M1 is you could throw that thing in a mud hole, drag it through it, pick it up, and it would fire. In Bastogne, we were in foxholes that would fill with water, then freeze, then melt again. Your rifle would be covered in ice and mud. With a bolt action, you'd spend half your time trying to keep the action clear. With the Garand, it just worked. And when the Germans came, that's what mattered. You could keep firing." The reliability Powers described wasn't accidental. John Garand had spent 16 years developing a gas system robust enough to function under the worst possible conditions, had designed a rifle with enough slop in the tolerances that ice and mud wouldn't jam the action, had created a weapon that prioritized battlefield functionality over precision manufacturing. German rifles were often more precisely made, but precision became a liability when ice formed in the action or mud clogged the bolt. The Garand's looser tolerances, originally a compromise for mass production, proved advantageous in winter combat, where weapons needed to function regardless of conditions. The firepower advantage that had proven decisive in Tunisia and Normandy remained equally important in the Ardennes. German tactical doctrine for the offensive emphasized speed and momentum, with infantry following armored breakthrough and exploiting gaps before American defenders could consolidate positions. But this doctrine assumed that German infantry could suppress American defensive fire long enough to close and overwhelm positions with grenades and close combat. The assumption failed when every American foxhole contained a soldier who could deliver 40 to 50 aimed shots per minute without pausing to work a bolt. Sergeant Bill Turner defended a farmhouse near Nocher with a squad of 9 men from the 26th Infantry Regiment on December 19th. German forces had been probing his position since dawn, testing defenses, looking for weaknesses. At 1100 hours, German artillery began falling on the farm, and enemy infantry advanced from a tree line 60 meters away. Turner's after-action report described what happened next. "They came straight at us, maybe 40-50 Germans in a skirmish line. We opened up with everything we had. 8 Garands, 1 Bayard. The volume of fire we put out stopped them cold at about 50 meters. They tried to go prone and return fire, but we just kept shooting. Every time a German popped up to work his bolt and take a shot, we had 8 rifles ready to engage him. They pulled back after maybe 2 minutes, left a dozen dead in the field. Turner's squad held that farmhouse for another 6 hours, repelling 3 more German assaults, with tactics that depended entirely on their ability to generate overwhelming volumes of rifle fire. A German squad with equivalent numbers, armed with Kar98ks, could not have produced the suppressive fire necessary to stop those attacks. The mathematical advantage that seemed theoretical in peacetime training had become the difference between holding a position and being overrun. The pattern repeated across the entire bulge. American units that should have been destroyed based on numerical calculations held positions that tactical doctrine suggested were untenable, primarily because their individual weapons provided firepower advantages that multiplied the effective strength of defensive positions. A platoon of 40 men with M1 Garands could deliver 1,600 to 2,000 aimed shots per minute. A German company of 120 men with Kar98ks could deliver 1,800 to 2,400 shots per minute, but only if they could all engage simultaneously, only if they weren't taking casualties, only if their machine guns remained operational. The firepower calculations shifted dramatically once casualties began. An American platoon that lost 25% of its strength still retained 75% of its firepower. A German company that lost 25% of its strength lost not just riflemen, but often the machine guns that provided the majority of squad firepower. The distributed nature of American firepower. Every rifleman, a significant contributor, made American units more resilient to attrition. By the end of January 1945, the bulge had been eliminated, and German forces were in full retreat toward the Rhine. The offensive had cost the Wehrmacht heavily in men and material it could not replace. But it had also cost the Germans something less tangible: the last illusion that superior tactics and training could overcome the American advantage in firepower. German soldier accounts from late 1944 and early 1945 reflect growing recognition that they were fighting a war they couldn't win. Not because American soldiers were better trained, many German units retained superior tactical skills even in defeat, but because American soldiers carried weapons that fundamentally changed what one infantryman could accomplish. Every engagement drove home the same lesson: bolt-action rifles, no matter how well-made or skillfully employed, could not compete with semi-automatic weapons in sustained combat. The final campaigns of the war in Europe, from the Rhine crossing in March 1945 to the German surrender in May, saw this advantage exploited to its fullest extent. American forces advanced rapidly through Germany, not just because they had overwhelming material superiority, not just because German resistance was collapsing, but because American infantry squads could generate the firepower necessary to suppress defensive positions while maintaining offensive momentum. The Battle for Aachen in October 1944 demonstrated this advantage in urban combat, where the M1 Garand's semi-automatic action proved particularly valuable. Staff Sergeant Joe Toye and his squad from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment fought house to house through German defensive positions, engaging enemy soldiers at ranges measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. Toye later described the urban fighting. In a building, when you come around a corner or kick in a door, you need to shoot fast and shoot accurately. With a bolt action, you fire once, and then you're working the bolt while the enemy is shooting back. With the Garand, you fire. Fire again. Keep firing until the threat is down. In close quarters, that's life and death. The psychological impact of the M1 Garand on German soldiers became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Captured German personnel interviewed after surrender repeatedly mentioned American rifle fire as one of the most demoralizing aspects of combat. Not because the M1 was more accurate than the Kar98k, in fact, the German rifle was slightly more accurate in controlled conditions, but because the continuous, relentless nature of semi-automatic fire created psychological pressure that bolt-action rifles could not match. A German soldier with a Kar98k understood that after firing his shot, He had, perhaps, 1 second while working his bolt before he could fire again. During that 1 second, he was vulnerable. An American soldier with an M1 Garand never experienced that vulnerability. He could fire, engage another target, fire again, maintain continuous pressure that gave the enemy no opportunity to respond effectively. This psychological advantage compounded the tactical advantage. German soldiers, facing overwhelming semi-automatic fire, made mistakes, exposed themselves at the wrong moments, rushed shots that should have been carefully aimed. The pressure of continuous incoming fire degraded German combat effectiveness in ways that were difficult to quantify but clearly observable in combat outcomes. The final statistics from the European theater tell the story clearly. American infantry units consistently achieved casualty exchange ratios that favored them despite often attacking prepared German defensive positions, despite facing an enemy with years of combat experience, despite operating in terrain that generally favored the defender. The M1 Garand wasn't the only reason for this advantage. American artillery, air support, and logistics all contributed. But infantrymen themselves credited their rifle as the primary reason they could take ground against determined opposition without suffering prohibitive casualties. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army during its drive across France and into Germany, famously called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. This wasn't empty praise. Patton understood that the rifle had fundamentally changed infantry combat, had made individual American soldiers more effective than individual German soldiers, despite Germany's longer martial tradition and more extensive pre-war training programs. The German military recognized this disparity. Captured documents from late 1944 show Wehrmacht ordnance officers evaluating semi-automatic rifle programs, attempting to accelerate production of the G43 and STG-44, trying desperately to provide German infantry with weapons that could match American firepower. But by 1944, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to retool factories, lacked the raw materials necessary for mass production, lacked the time to train soldiers on new weapon systems. The Kar98ks remained the standard German infantry rifle until the end of the war, not because it was the best choice, not because German planners preferred bolt-action rifles, but because Germany could not produce enough semi-automatic weapons to replace it. Between 1936 and 1945, German factories produced approximately 14 million Kar98ks rifles. In the same period, American factories produced 3.4 million M1 Garands and equipped every frontline infantryman with the semi-automatic weapon. That production differential reflected more than just industrial capacity. It reflected a fundamental difference in military philosophy. The United States had committed to semi-automatic rifles for its infantry before the war began, had invested years and millions of dollars developing a reliable design, had built factories specifically designed to mass-produce the M1 efficiently. Germany had focused its resources elsewhere, on machine guns, tanks, artillery, aircraft, and had assumed that bolt-action rifles would remain adequate for infantry combat. The assumption cost them dearly. Not in any single battle. Hill 609 was strategically insignificant, one minor action among thousands, but across the entire war, in the accumulated advantage of thousands of firefights where American soldiers could deliver more rounds downrange than their German opponents, where 8 men with Garands could accomplish what German doctrine assumed required 20 men with Kar98ks Staff Sergeant Peterson survive the war. He fought from Tunisia, through Sicily, through Italy, eventually through southern France. He carried his M1 Garand through every campaign, cleaned it every evening, counted his clips, checked his ammunition supply. The rifle that had given him the advantage on Hill 609 in April 1943 continued giving him that same advantage through every subsequent engagement. Peterson was wounded 3 times, earned 2 Silver Stars and a Bronze Star, and returned home to Illinois in November 1945 with his M1 Garand. The Army let him keep it as a souvenir, one of thousands of Garands that veterans brought home as reminders of what they'd carried through the war. He kept that rifle for the rest of his life, cleaned and maintained it, even though he never fired it again after the war, kept it as a reminder of the weapon that had kept him alive when mathematics and firepower mattered more than courage or training. The M1 Garand remained the standard US service rifle until 1957, when it was replaced by the M14. It served through the Korean War, saw limited use in Vietnam, and established the template for every military rifle that followed. The semi-automatic action that John Garand perfected became the baseline, standard for infantry weapons worldwide. Modern military rifles are fully automatic descendants of the M1's gas-operated system, refined and improved, but kill on the same fundamental principle. One trigger pull should fire one round without requiring manual action cycling. The German Kar98ks, despite being outclassed by the M1 in every tactical measure, remained in production and service long after 1945. Millions of captured Kar98ks were redistributed by the Soviet Union to various nations, saw service in conflicts across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East for decades after World War II ended. The rifle itself was excellent, accurate, reliable, well-made, but it was a weapon designed for a previous generation of warfare, a generation where bolt-action rifles were standard and firepower came from crew-served weapons rather than individual infantrymen. The story of the M1 Garand versus the Kar98ks isn't really a story about which rifle was better made or which country had superior gunsmiths. Both rifles were well-designed, well-manufactured, reliable weapons. The story is about industrial vision, about the willingness to invest in revolutionary technology before war began, about understanding that future wars would be won by nations that could equip every soldier with weapons that multiplied individual effectiveness. The United States made that investment in 1936 when they adopted the M1 Garand as standard issue. Germany did not. That decision, made years before the first shots of World War II were fired, shaped the outcome of thousands of small firefights where American soldiers like Peterson faced German soldiers like the men who died on Hill 609. In Tunisia, where 8 rounds, without pausing, proved superior to 5 rounds that required bolt cycling, where 40 shots per minute overwhelmed 15 shots per minute through simple mathematics that no amount of training or courage could overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.